In this world, everyone was chasing after gold. They believed that value lay only in gold, and that clay, wood, and iron were nothing but trash underfoot. He knew they were wrong, and he proved it with a handful of dirt scooped up from the pavement just a minute before they tried to chop off his hand. Cold water floods Dan's nose and mouth. His whole body jerks, and he rolls onto his side. A dirty puddle, cobblestone pavement, the smell of manure and something spicy. He sits up, blinks, and looks up. The sky is too blue, not Portland blue, not gray. He looks at his hands, the same calluses, the same cracks on his knuckles, the same fingers that turned the potter's wheel yesterday. Only everything around him is foreign. The stone walls of the houses soar upward. Somewhere far above the rooftops, gilded spires glisten. A cart loaded with barrels is being dragged past. A man in a leather apron spits at his feet and grumbles about vagrants. The last thing Dan remembers is the steering wheel of the pickup truck and the heaviness in his eyelids. Then darkness. And now, a bustling medieval street with mud under his fingernails. His pockets are empty, no phone, no coins. And then a fat man in an embroidered vest comes flying around the corner and grabs him by the collar. He's yelling that Dan stole a copper coin. Dan doesn't understand where he knows this language from, but he understands every word. 2 guards in chainmail are already crossing the square. One pulls a truncheon from his belt. Dan looks at the merchant, then at the guards, then down at his feet. A lump of wet clay lies against the wall, reddish, dense. Dan grabs it and rolls it between his fingers. Good plasticity, about 20% sand, high iron content, red hot. The guards are 10 paces away. The merchant demands that the thief's hand be cut off. But Dan looks at the clay in his palm and smiles. He's already figured out a thing or two about this world. There's material here, which means he can work here. He throws his hands up, turns to the guards, calmly says he didn't steal anything, that he's a master, a craftsman, and he'll prove it right now. Across the street stands a tavern. On the porch sits a heavy-set, red-necked owner with a beer stain on his apron. Dan points at him. He says he'll make something out of this junk that the man doesn't have, and if the thing turns out to be worth it, let it cover the debt for the penny he didn't take. The owner's name is Bert. His face is like a baked apple, small, intelligent eyes. He walks over and asks what kind of thing it is. Dan asks if he has a pitcher from which one can pour without spilling on the table. Bert snorts. There's no such thing as a pitcher like that. Everyone spills. Everyone knows that. Dan asks for an hour and access to the stove. Bert stares at him for a long time. Then he waves his hand. If the vagabond is lying, the guards will take him away. If not, Bert wants to see that jug. Dan steps into the cramped, smoky kitchen. The stove is fired with wood. The heat won't be enough for a proper firing, but it'll do for a first try. He kneads the clay. He removes the pebbles. He adds water, and his fingers move on their own. 12 years of muscle memory. The sides are smooth. The bottom is flat. He shapes the spout into a special form. He bends the inner edge so that when tilted, the stream flows evenly and doesn't run down the side. A simple law of surface tension. On Earth, every decent potter knows it. Here, no one does. Bert freezes in the doorway. Workers crowd in behind him. A girl of about 16 with a rag cranks her neck out from behind someone's shoulder. Huge eyes. She isn't looking at the jug. She's staring intently at Dan's hands. He doesn't notice. He's in the zone, the only place where he's ever felt at home. 40 minutes later, the jug is ready, raw. Dan places it in the hottest corner of the kiln. He asks for more firewood. 2 hours later, he pulls it out. Rough, grayish red, unglazed, but it stands, and it has a working spout. Dan scoops up water. He tilts the pitcher over the table. A thin, even stream falls precisely into the mug. Not a drop goes astray. Bert blinks. Dan pours some more, and some more. 3 mugs. The table is dry. Bert grabs the pitcher. He turns it around, tries it himself. The stream flows evenly. He sets it down and looks at Dan as if seeing him for the first time. He says that in 30 years in the tavern business, he hasn't come across a vessel from which you can pour without spilling on the tablecloth. He asks the price. Dan asks for dinner and a place to sleep. Bert is silent for a second. Then he nods. The food is hot. He can sleep in the hayloft. The merchant outside is still grumbling about a copper coin. Bert barks, and the man disappears. The guards lose interest, too. Dan eats hot soup at a corner table, thick, with root vegetables and chunks of meat. His first meal in this world, he chews and weighs the facts. The city is large, a population of 100,000, late Middle Ages, and magic. At the next table, two men are haggling over the price of an enchanted lantern. Gold here isn't just money. Gold is the foundation of everything. Artifacts, status, power. And clay, wood, iron, bone, those are just trash. Dan looks at his hands. For 12 years, these hands have worked with every one of these materials and turned junk into things that left people on Earth speechless. 800,000 subscribers watched as beauty was born from the dirt. In this world, everyone believes that value lies in gold, but he knows it lies in the hands, in the mind, in understanding why things work. The hayloft smells of dry grass. A bell is ringing somewhere. A foreign world, strange rules. But the clay is the same, the fire is the same, and the hands are the same. Dan clenches his fists, unclenches them. Let's go. Morning strikes with cold and a rooster's crow. Bert sets porridge and a mug of bitter herbal tea before him. He sits down across from him. He asks where Dan is from. Dan says, from far away. Bert snorts. Dan has the hands of a craftsman, but his accent is foreign and his clothes are strange. Then he drops a hint. Craftsmen live across the bridge. Potters, leather workers, one glassblower. All of them are destitute. They're barely scraping by because the Alchemist Guild buys up all the raw materials and drives up prices. If Dan is truly a master craftsman, he belongs there. But without a guild badge, a craftsman has a hard time in Vesper. The guild doesn't like outsiders. Dan steps out onto the street. Vesper is huge. It's bustling. It's alive. Gilded domes gleam over the center. Toward the outskirts, the gilding slides down into peeling plaster, and beyond that, the slums begin. Dan walks and looks. A woman carries water in a bucket full of holes, and half of it spills out. A blacksmith pounds iron with a hammer, without any rhythm, just pounding. A boy lights an oil lamp, and the oil runs down the wall and drips onto the floor. Dan calculates in his head. Problems with sealing, with the design, with the materials, with the basic engineering that people on Earth knew thousands of years ago. This world grew up around gold and magic. Everything that didn't concern them fell centuries behind. People here live as if the wheel were invented yesterday. Dan crosses the bridge. The artisan's quarter is quiet and dusty. Narrow streets, low houses with workshops on the ground floor. Too many shuttered windows, too few customers. The potter's shop is closed. The tanner's is empty. And then he sees the glassblower's shop. The sign hangs crooked. The door is open. Dan goes inside. It's hot in there and smells of smoke. An old man is sitting on an upside-down crate by the wall. Thin, yellow skin, red, watery eyes. He coughs into a rag, and the rag is brown. Broken, crooked, cloudy glass lies all around. The shelves are half empty. What's left looks pitiful. Bubbles, uneven walls, dull color. The old man lifts his head and asks what he needs. Dan says he's a craftsman and is looking for work. The old man smirks. Orders went to the guildmasters 2 years ago. His name is Orwin, a third-generation glassblower, and the last glassblower in the neighborhood. Dan looks over the furnace, old, but still working. The sand in the corner is coarse river sand with impurities. Broken glass crunches underfoot. Then he asks if there's any beech wood ash. Orvin blinks. There is ash, a whole bag of it. Nobody needs it. Dan nods. Beech ash is potash, potassium carbonate, a flux that lowers the melting point and makes the glass transparent. On Earth, they've known this since the days of the Venetian masters. Here, it's just trash. Dan asks to try. Orvin shrugs. Nothing to lose. Dan rolls up his sleeves. He sifts through the sand, removes the larger particles, adds the ash in the right proportion. He finds a piece of lime on the shelf and tosses it in. Silica, potash, lime, the three basic components of glass. Orvin watches, not understanding what's happening. Dan loads the batch into the furnace, adjusts the draft, blows the fire up to its limit, waits. 2 hours, 3. Orvin dozes on a box, wakes up, coughs. He dozes off again. By evening, the glass is ready. Dan picks up a rough, heavy blowpipe. He scoops up a drop of molten glass. He blows it out, slowly, turning the blowpipe, shaping a bubble, drawing out the neck. Orvin wakes up from the silence. He lifts his head. On the table stands a small vial, transparent, without a single bubble. The walls are thin and smooth. Light passes right through it and plays on the wall with iridescent glints. Orvin stands up. He walks over. He takes the vial with trembling fingers. He holds it up to his eyes. Tears stream down his cheeks. He says that in 40 years at the furnace, he hasn't seen glass like this, that it's like rock crystal, that this is worth its weight in gold in Vesper. Dan says he made it from what was lying by the door, from sand, from ash, from lime. Orvin places the vial on the shelf, wipes his face with his sleeve, turns to Dan, calls him his son, says that if Dan wants, this workshop is his home. The first morning in Orvin's workshop began with the old man's cough, heavy, wailing. Dan lay on a bench in the corner and listened. The coughing lasted about 3 minutes, then it subsided. Orvin spat into a rag and shuffled over to the stove. Dan opened his eyes. It was cold in the workshop. Gray light seeped through the dirty window. Yesterday's bottle stood on the shelf. He hadn't imagined it. Dan stood up and stretched. His back ached from the hard bench, but his hands didn't hurt. His hands never hurt. He walked over to Orvin. The old man was already stoking the stove. His movements were slow, cautious. His hands were trembling. Dan silently took the poker from him and tossed some wood on the fire. Orvin looked up at him. There was gratitude in his eyes, and something else. Shame. The old master's shame before the young man for the fact that his hands no longer obeyed him. Dan pretended not to notice. He asked how many orders Orvin had. The old man waved his hand. 2. The pharmacist from the next street had been waiting for 6 vials for 3 weeks already, and the tailor's widow had ordered a flower vase 2 months ago. Orvin couldn't make them. The glass came out cloudy and warped. He said the furnace wasn't drawing as well anymore, that the sand was poor these days, that the winter had been damp and the materials had gotten damp. Dan listened and nodded. He knew it wasn't the furnace or the sand. It was the proportions of the batch, the temperature control, the blowing technique. A dozen little details that Orvin did exactly as his father had taught him. And his father had been taught by his grandfather, and no one in that chain understood why it had to be done that way. They'd just always done it that way. Dan asked if he could fill these orders. Orvin paused, then he nodded. He told Dan to take whatever he needed. Dan started with the apothecary jars, 6 of them, a simple shape. Airtightness and transparency were key. He prepared the batch according to yesterday's recipe. Sand, beech ash, lime, a ratio of 7 to 2 to 1. He loaded it into the furnace. While the glass was melting, he examined the workshop more closely. The tools were old but sturdy. Glass shears, pliers, tweezers, several molds made of fired clay. Dan found something interesting. On the far shelf stood 3 jars of powders. He opened one, sniffed it. Iron oxide. The second, copper oxide. The third, something fine and white. It looked like ground quartz. Dyes. Orvin had once tried making colored glass. Dan asked, and the old man confirmed it. He'd tried. It didn't work out. The color came out muddy, uneven, spotty. Dan nodded. Iron oxide produces green or yellow, depending on the firing atmosphere. Copper oxide produces blue in an oxidizing environment and red in a reducing one. On Earth, colored glass has been known since ancient Egypt. Here, it was something bordering on magic. Dan set the jars aside. It wasn't time yet. Basic orders first. The glass had melted by noon. Dan blew 6 vials in an hour and a half. Identical, smooth, with fitted stoppers made of wood wrapped in linen cloth for a tight seal. Orvin sat nearby and watched. His mouth was slightly open. He watched Dan work with the blowpipe. A steady rotation, controlled exhalation, precise movements with the scissors, not a single superfluous gesture. Each glass was a copy of the one before it. After the vials, Dan started on a vase. The tailor's widow wanted a vase for flowers. Dan asked Orvin what kind of woman she was. The old man shrugged, said she was old, lonely. Her husband had died 5 years ago. She gathered flowers in a vacant lot outside the city wall. Wildflowers, small ones. Dan thought for a moment. Then he nodded. He made the vase short, with a wide, stable base so it wouldn't tip over from an accidental movement. The neck was narrow, tapered. Wildflowers are small and have thin stems. In a wide vase, they droop and look pitiful. In a narrow neck, they'd stand in a tight bunch. They'll look like a bouquet. And one more detail. Dan added a pinch of copper oxide to the batch for this vase, just a tiny bit. Instead of colorless glass, it turned out with a subtle bluish tint, barely noticeable, like the morning sky. Orvin saw the color and held his breath. He asked how. Dan said he'd added powder from his shelf, the very same one that hadn't worked. He just needed less, much less, and a different temperature. Orvin touched the vase. He ran his finger along the side. It was smooth and slightly warm from the furnace. The blue glass caught the light from the window and cast a soft spot. The old man said nothing. He just sat back down on his box and stared at the vase for a long time. By evening, Dan took the vials to the apothecary. The man checked each one against the light. He turned them over. He tested the stoppers. He set them on the table and looked at Dan. He said he hadn't received vials like these in 20 years. He said he usually bought them from the guild glassblowers for 3 silver pieces apiece. He asked how much Dan wanted. Dan named 2 silver pieces apiece. The apothecary didn't haggle. He paid 12 silver pieces and immediately ordered another dozen. On the way back, Dan bought some food. Bread, cheese, a piece of smoked meat, apples. He brought it to the workshop. Orvin looked at the food and then at the money. Dan put the silver on the table. He said it was the workshop's money, not his. Orvin told Dan to take half. Dan refused. He said he had enough food and shelter for now, and the money was needed for raw materials, for new sand, for firewood for the furnace, for tools. Orvin chewed on the bread and cried silently. Dan ate the cheese and thought about tomorrow. On the third morning, the first visitor appeared in the workshop. Not a customer. Just a man who had heard from the apothecary about the clear glass jars and wanted to take a look. A second one followed, then a third. By noon, there were about 10 people standing at the door. Orvin was flustered. He wasn't used to the attention. Dan went out to the people. He asked what they needed. Questions poured out. One wanted a wine bottle. Another asked if they could make window glass. A third woman was holding a child by the hand and asking about a lamp. Dan listened to everyone. He memorized their requests. He nodded. Then he returned to the workshop and began to write things down. With a piece of charcoal on a scrap of wood, a list of orders, a bottle, a window, a lamp, 3 vases, a set of test tubes for the herbalist, a mirror. At the word mirror, Dan paused. A mirror. In this world, mirrors were luxury items. They were made of polished silver or gold. He hadn't seen any glass mirrors yet, and making a glass mirror wasn't technically difficult. Glass, a thin layer of metal on the back. Tin would work. Lead would work. A mixture would work. 16th century Murano mirror technology. Dan rubbed his chin. A mirror could become something serious, something that would change his standing in this city. But it was too early for that. First, he needed to fill the simple orders, build a foundation, get the process running smoothly. He made a note next to the mirror. Later. That evening, Dan sat on the workshop threshold and looked out onto the street. The artisan's quarter was growing quiet. The blacksmith across the way had shut his shutters. Dan noticed that the blacksmith had no right arm below the elbow. A leather sleeve covered the stump. The blacksmith worked with just his left hand, slowly, with difficulty. His hammer was too heavy for one hand. Dan made a mental note. A girl was standing next to the workshop, the same one from Bert's tavern, with a rag in her hands. She had come after her shift. She stood there looking at the workshop. Dan asked her name. Hana's son, 16 years old, an orphan. She works for Bert in exchange for food and a place to sleep. She mops floors, scrubs pots, carries water. Dan asked why she had come. Hana paused. Then she said she wanted to watch him work. Dan said watching was boring. Hana said no. She said that when he was making a jug in Bert's kitchen, she saw how his hands moved. She said it was beautiful. Dan looked at her more closely. Skinny, dirty, her fingers red from lye. But her eyes were alive, smart. He remembered how she'd looked at the pitcher, not at the jug. At the process, at the movements. Dan stood up, went into the workshop, brought out a piece of clay, the same red lump he'd picked up on the first day. He handed it to Hana. She said she didn't know how. Dan said that nobody knows how at first. He asked her to just make a ball. Hana took the clay. Her hands were shaking. She kneaded the lump clumsily. But a minute later, Dan saw her tilt her head slightly. She looked at the ball, and with her fingers, she adjusted one side. Just a little. Just enough to make the ball smoother. She did it without thinking, instinctively. A sense of form, innate. Dan took the ball from her. He looked at it. He said she had the hands of a master, that he could see it. Hana dropped her hands. Her lips trembled. She turned away. She stood like that for about 10 seconds. Then she turned back. Her eyes were red. She asked if she could come by after work, to learn. Dan nodded. He said she could come whenever she wanted. Hana clenched her fists. She nodded and walked off into the darkness. Dan stood in the doorway. Orvin was already snoring inside. A blue bottle sat on the shelf, catching the last light of the fading day. The neighborhood was silent, but Dan felt that the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of dying. It was the silence before the beginning. The week flew by at work. Dan filled orders one after another. Wine bottles, a lamp, 3 vases, a set of test tubes for an herbalist. He made each piece slightly better than the last. He adjusted the proportions of the batch. He changed the firing temperature. He experimented with shapes. The glass turned out clearer and thinner. The line at the door didn't get any shorter. By the end of the first week, rumors of the transparent glass had spread from the artisans' quarter to the market stalls in the center of Vesper. On the morning of the 8th day, a carriage pulled up to the workshop. Not a luxurious one, but well-maintained. A woman of about 40 in a dark dress stepped out. Behind her was a servant carrying a small chest. The woman entered the workshop and looked around. Her nose twitched slightly at the smell of smoke and sweat, but her eyes settled on a shelf of finished goods. Vials, jars, a blue vase. She picked up a vial, turned it in the light, looked through the glass, put it back, turned to Dan. Asked who the craftsman was. Dan said it was him. The woman introduced herself, Mrs. Merritt, the wife of a major merchant from the upper city. She said she needed a set for a dressing table, bottles for oils, jars for ointments, and a mirror. Dan asked what kind of mirror she had in mind. Merritt said she wanted a tabletop mirror in which one could see one's face, not a piece of polished silver for which they asked 20 gold pieces. But something better. She'd heard that in the southern cities there was glass that reflected, but she hadn't seen it herself. Dan said he could make it. Merritt asked the price. Dan quoted 5 gold pieces for the whole set, including the mirror. Merritt looked at him for 5 seconds, then she nodded. She opened the little chest, took out 2 gold coins, placed them on the table. A down payment, the rest upon delivery. Dan took the coins, heavy, warm, his first gold in this world. When the carriage drove away, Orvin sat down on his crate and stared at the coins. He said that 2 gold coins was more than he had earned in the last year. He said that Dan was crazy, that a mirror made of glass was impossible. Dan smiled. He said it was possible. He explained the principle. Flat glass, very thin, very smooth. The back, a thin layer of metal is applied, tin or lead. The metal reflects light. The glass protects the surface. Orwin listened. He didn't believe it, but he didn't argue. Over the past week, He'd gotten used to Dan saying impossible things and then doing them. The problem was the flat glass. Blowing a bubble is easy. Turning a bubble into a smooth, flat sheet is difficult. On Earth, the cylinder method was used for this. You blow a long cylinder. You cut it lengthwise. You unroll it into a flat sheet while the glass is hot and malleable. You roll it out. Dan practiced for 2 days. The first 3 cylinders burst. The 4th came out crooked. The 5th cracked when he unfolded it. Hana came every evening and sat in the corner. She watched. She was silent. On the 3rd evening, Dan gave her a task: to prepare the work surface. A perfectly flat board sprinkled with fine sand so the glass wouldn't stick while rolling. Hana did it, and she did it better than Dan expected. The board was sanded smooth with a stone. The sand was sifted and spread evenly. Dan looked at the board and nodded. He didn't say a word, but Hana saw his nod, and her shoulders straightened slightly. The 6th cylinder was ready. Dan cut it open with a red-hot knife. He unfolded it. He rolled it out on Hana's board. The sheet wasn't perfect, slightly wavy at the edges, but the center was even, good enough for a palm-sized mirror. Now for the metal. Dan went to the blacksmith across the street, the one-armed one. His name was Greg, a burly man of about 35. His face was scarred on the right side, that same side where he'd lost his arm. Dan asked if he had any tin. Greg grumbled that he had a little. He asked why. Dan said he wanted to roll the tin into a very thin sheet, thinner than paper. Greg looked at him like he was crazy. He said it was impossible to roll tin into a sheet thinner than paper with one hand. Dan said he'd help. They worked together for 3 hours. Greg held the piece with one hand. Dan struck it with a hammer, gently, carefully, layer by layer. The tin flattened out. It got thinner. Greg sniffed. Dan sensed that the blacksmith felt awkward, that he was ashamed of his stump, of the fact that he couldn't do the work himself. Dan didn't mention it. He just worked beside him. By the end of the 3rd hour, they had a sheet of tin as thin as a flower petal. Greg looked at it and smiled for the first time since they'd started talking. It was crooked, just one corner of his mouth, but he smiled. Dan offered him a silver coin for the tin. Greg took it. He assembled the mirror that evening. He laid the tin sheet on a flat surface. He poured a thin layer of mercury on top. He'd found the mercury at the apothecary's. Expensive. A whole silver coin for a thimbleful. But for the mirror, he only needed a drop. The mercury dissolved into the tin, forming an amalgam. Shiny, reflective. Dan carefully placed a sheet of glass on top, pressed it down, left it overnight. In the morning, he picked it up. He looked. His own face was staring back at him from the glass. Sharp, clear, not a blurry reflection in polished metal. Real. His face. With 3 days' worth of stubble, with bags under his eyes from lack of sleep, with clay dust on his cheekbone. Dan blinked. The reflection blinked. He saw himself in this world for the first time, and froze for a second, because the face was his, the same one, from Earth, the same eyes, the same scar on his chin from falling off a stepladder at 18. Him, here, real. Orvin walked over and peered into the mirror. He recoiled. Then he approached again, slowly. He touched the glass with his finger. He saw his face, old, yellowed, worn out. He stood there for a long time. Then he said quietly that he hadn't seen his face in 20 years, that silver mirrors were too expensive for a glassblower from the lower quarter, and that he hadn't known he'd grown so old. Dan put his hand on his shoulder. Hana came in the evening. She saw the mirror on the table. She walked over. She looked, and froze. She stared at her reflection without moving. Dan saw her fingers clench the edge of the table. She had never seen her own face. The polished copper at Bert's tavern had only given her a blurry smudge. Hana looked at herself, at her eyes, at her cheekbones, at the scar above her eyebrow, at her dirty hair. She raised her hand and touched her reflection. Then she turned away, quickly. Dan saw that her shoulders were shaking. He didn't say anything. He just went back to work. He gave her time. 10 minutes later, Hannah came over and silently began picking up the broken glass from the floor. Her eyes were red, but her hands weren't shaking. Dan finished the set for Mrs. Moret in 2 days. 5 bottles of various sizes for oils, 3 jars with ground-in lids for ointments, and a mirror, a tabletop mirror, in a simple wooden frame that he had carved himself. The frame was made from a scrap of oak he had found behind the workshop, but Dan had sanded it smooth and rubbed it with wax. The wood gleamed, warm, alive, beautiful. When Moret saw the set, she was silent for a full minute. Then she picked up the mirror. She looked into it. Her face twitched. She was a woman past her prime, wrinkles around her eyes, gray hair at her temples. But the mirror showed all of this without pity and without flattery, just the truth. Merritt set the mirror down. She took out her wallet. She placed 3 gold coins on the table. Dan reminded her that they had agreed on 3. Merritt said she knew. She said the 3rd gold coin wasn't for the work. It was for seeing herself for the first time in her life. Then she said she would tell her friends about the workshop. Dan thanked her. Merritt left. 2 days later, 3 of her friends came. Each one wanted a mirror. The money went out. Dan didn't put it in his wallet. He went shopping. The best quality sand from the river spit, bags of beechwood ash, tin from Greg, new tools, the best firewood for the furnace. He refurbished the lining of Orvin's furnace, replaced the cracked bricks, rebuilt the chimney. The draft improved. The temperature rose by 100 degrees. The glass became even clearer. Dan worked 14 hours a day. In the morning, he melted glass. In the afternoon, he blew orders. In the evening, he taught Hannah. The girl came every day after her shift at Bert's, tired, with red hands, but with eyes that burned. Dan didn't teach her glass. It was too early for that. He taught her clay. He gave her a lump of clay and asked her to make a cup, then another, then a third. Hannah would break them and remake them. She'd get angry at herself. She'd clench her teeth. Dan saw how she improved day by day. Each new cup was smoother than the last, the walls thinner, the shape more precise. Her hands learned faster than those of any student Dan had seen on Earth. By the end of the 2nd week, Hannah had made a cup she wasn't ashamed to put on the table. A month in Vesper. Dan counted the money on the table. 18 gold pieces and a handful of silver. For a month. From nothing. From sand and ash. Orvin sat nearby and couldn't believe it. He had never held so much gold in his hands at once in his entire life. The workshop had changed. The kiln was running smoothly. The shelves were filled with finished pieces, vials, vases, mirrors, 3 types of colored glass, blue, green, and amber, which Dan had produced by adding iron oxide in a reducing atmosphere. There was a line at the door every day. Rumors spread through the city like ripples on water. A glass blower from the lower quarter makes clear glass without gold. He makes mirrors 10 times cheaper than silver ones. He makes colored glass that only the guild could make before. But Dan saw that glass wasn't enough. 1 product, 1 workshop, 1 pair of hands. He thought bigger. In the artisans' quarter, there were 7 more closed workshops, a pottery workshop, 2 tanneries, a carpentry shop, a soap factory, a dye house, and one that no one could identify. Dan went around to all of them. The pottery workshop was abandoned. The roof had caved in, but the kiln was still intact, a massive brick structure. Dan inspected it. A good kiln, large, with proper draft. If the roof were repaired and the chimney cleaned, it could be used. The tanneries smelled so bad it made his eyes water. But the equipment was there. Vats, stretching frames, scrapers. The carpentry shop was empty. The tools had been taken out long ago, but the workbench remained. The soap kitchen. Dan lingered there the longest. A cauldron, molds, a shelf with dried up chunks of something gray. He picked up a piece, sniffed it. Lye, animal fat, local soap, coarse, smelly, poor lather. Back on Earth, Dan used to make soap as a hobby. Cold process, hot process, soap from scratch, soap made from ash. He knew that good soap was the right balance of fat and lye. that oil needed to be added for softness, that herbs could be used for fragrance, that soap could be more than just a lump of fat. It could be an object that felt good to hold. In this world, soap was a luxury for the rich and a torment for the poor. Dan made a mental note. Soap. Another product. Another niche. He returned to Orvin's workshop, sat down, took a piece of charcoal, drew a plan on the board. The artisan's quarter. 7 workshops. Each can produce something. Glass, ceramics, leather, soap, wood, fabric, dyes. If at least 3 of them get up and running, the quarter will start turning a profit. Not like a lone glassblower, like a neighborhood, like a community. The problem is the people. There are no craftsmen. They've left. Drunk themselves to death. Died. Young people go to work as servants for the nobility or as day laborers at the market. No one wants to be a craftsman, because a craftsman in Vesper is a beggar with calluses. Dan erased the plan, drew a new one. Names. Orvin, glassblower, works. Greg, blacksmith, one-handed, barely gets by. Hannah, apprentice, learns fast. Bert, innkeeper, not a master but an ally. The apothecary, client and potential partner. Lady Merritt, a client from the upper city, a sales channel. Not enough. Too few people. Dan rubbed his eyes. He was tired. A month with almost no days off. 14 hours at the furnace every day. His back ached. His eyes were watering from the heat. His fingers were covered in small burns. But he couldn't stop. The moment was right. There was demand. The money was coming in. He needs to expand. The next morning, Dan did 2 things. First, he went to Greg and proposed a deal. Dan would repair his tools and make a special anvil clamp that would allow him to secure the workpiece without using his other hand. In exchange, Greg would forge hardware for him. Hinges, brackets, mirror frames, small metal parts that are always needed. Greg listened. He frowned. Then he asked what kind of clamp it was. Dan explained. A simple screw clamp on a vise. It attaches to the edge of the anvil. The workpiece is held between the jaws. One hand is free for the hammer. Greg was silent. Then he said that didn't exist. Dan said he'd make one. He carved a model out of wood in 2 hours. He showed Greg how it worked. Greg looked at the wooden model. His expression changed. First, disbelief. Then interest. Then something Dan couldn't quite put into words. Greg took the model in his one good hand. He turned it. He pressed it against the edge of the anvil. He gripped the imaginary workpiece. He raised an imaginary hammer and froze. His eyes were shining. He didn't say a word. He just nodded. Then he sat down and began to draw a blueprint in the sand on the floor. A real blueprint, with dimensions, with details. Greg was a good blacksmith. Dan could tell right away. Not a handyman, a master, whom an injury had driven into a corner, who didn't need a new tool, but a new way of thinking about his work. The clamp was ready in 3 days. Greg forged it himself, with one hand, using Dan's wooden model as a template. The first time Greg clamped the horseshoe in the vise and struck it with the hammer, ringing, precise, with force. He stood there, breathing heavily, and Dan could see it wasn't from fatigue. The second thing Dan did that day, he found the soap kitchen, opened the door, cleaned out the cauldron, found a sack of ash under the shed. Beech, the same kind used for glass. Dan knew that beech ash produces lye when soaked. Lye, mild, perfect for soap. He bought the fat at the market. Pork, cheap, smelly, but it would do for the first batch. The process was simple. Lye from the ash, fat, heating, stirring, saponification. Dan boiled the soap for 3 hours. The foam rose and fell. The smell was heavy. But by evening, a bar had set in the mold. The next morning, Dan took it out. Gray, rough. But when he wet his hands and rubbed the soap between his palms, the lather was thick and soft. Not harsh, not smelly. The soap washed away dirt easily, and his skin didn't sting afterward. Dan smiled. perfect for a first attempt. But it could be better. He remembered his recipes from Earth. Olive oil provides softness. Coconut oil provides lather. There's neither here. But there are other oils, flaxseed, hemp oil, and there's probably nut oil. He needed to experiment. And herbs for scent, lavender, mint, rosemary. All of that grows in any wasteland. Dan brought a bar of soap to Bert's tavern. Bert sniffed it. He wrinkled his nose. He washed his hands, sniffed his hands, frowned a little less, washed them again, looked at his hands. They were clean, really clean. Bert asked what it was. Dan said soap. Bert said he knew what soap was. Soap costs a silver coin a bar and makes your skin peel off in flakes. Dan said this was different soap. Bert tried it again. Then he asked how much of this soap Dan could make. Dan said not much yet, 10 bars a week. But if he got the process going, 100. Bert scratched his chin, said he'd take 5 bars for the tavern, see how it goes. Dan nodded. That evening he sat on the threshold of the workshop. The neighborhood was coming to life. Greg was hammering away, ringing and confident. Hannah was inside kneading clay for tomorrow's class. Orvin was asleep. Beyond the bridge, Vesper was bustling, a city of gilded domes and starving slums. Dan looked at his hands in the light of the oil lamp, scorched, covered in cuts, covered in clay dust. Beautiful hands. He thought about how he'd done more in a month than in the first year of the workshop in Portland. Because everything is simpler here. There's no competition here, no internet, no AliExpress with cheap mass-produced goods. Here, there's only him and his knowledge, and people who need things, good things, made for them. Dan closed his eyes. Tomorrow he needed to find someone to make soap. He couldn't do everything himself. He needed people, craftsmen, or at least apprentices, someone he could teach. Hannah was on her own. Greg was busy with his blacksmith shop. Orvin was sick. Dan clenched his fists. He was building something. For the first time in his life, he wasn't building an object, but something bigger, something alive. Something with people inside, and that was scary, because you can't let an object down, but you can let people down. Ella Vanderlyn came to the craftsman's quarter at the end of the second month. Dan remembered that day because that morning, for the first time, Orwin didn't get up from his bench. His cough had gotten worse. The rag after him was red, not brown. Dan sat beside him and held the old man's hand. Orwin said everything was fine, that he was just tired, that he'd be up by lunchtime. Dan nodded. He didn't argue. But when he stepped outside, his hands were shaking. Not from the cold, from helplessness. He could make a jug that wouldn't spill. He could make glass as clear as crystal, but he couldn't cure the old man he called father. Ella showed up around noon. A young woman in a worn but neat travel dress, her hair tucked under a simple bonnet. Her posture was straight, her shoulders were squared. Dan could tell right away that she wasn't from the lower city. By the way she stood, by the way she held her head, by the way her eyes swept over the workshop with an appraising gaze, a professional one. She was assessing. Dan could see it. She was assessing the value of the goods on the shelves, the size of the room, the number of finished items. She did it automatically, just as he automatically assessed the plasticity of the clay. Ella introduced herself, the daughter of Baron Vanderlyn of Upper Redmark, a small estate 2 days' journey from Vesper. She spoke briefly and without embellishment. Her father had died a year ago. Debts. Her mother was ill. 3 younger sisters. The family jewels were pawned. The land was mortgaged. All that remained was the estate and the title. Both would soon be taken away to pay the debts. Ella had come to Vesper to find a way out. She'd heard of a master who worked wonders with clay, and she wanted to commission something she could sell, something expensive. Dan listened. He nodded. He asked what exactly she wanted. Ella said she didn't know. She said she didn't understand the craft. She said she understood money and trade. Dan asked why she needed money. Ella looked at him, hard. She said so her sisters wouldn't have to go work as servants for the people who took their home away. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he asked something else. He asked how much the guild mirrors cost. Ella answered instantly. A silver tabletop one starts at 20 gold. A floor-standing one at 50. Gilded and engraved ones start at 100. Dan asked how many mirrors were sold in Vesper in a month. Ella answered again without hesitation. About 40, mostly small ones. Demand is high, but the price cuts out 9 out of 10 buyers. Dan nodded. He asked, what if the mirror cost 3 gold pieces instead of 20? Ella fell silent. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She was calculating in her head. Dan could see her calculating, quickly, precisely. If the price drops 6-fold, demand goes up. Not just 6-fold, more. Because a new market opens up. Merchants' wives, shopkeepers, even well-to-do townswomen. Everyone who wanted a mirror but couldn't afford a silver one. Ella looked up. She said that if Dan could make 10 mirrors a week at 3 gold each, that's 30 gold a week, 120 a month, minus raw materials and expenses, a net profit of about 80 gold pieces. Dan smiled. That was exactly what he had calculated. Ella looked at him. Then she said he needed a manager, someone to handle sales, negotiate with customers, keep the books, buy raw materials, while he stood at the forge. Dan asked if she was offering herself. Ella said yes. Dan asked why he should trust her. Ella said he shouldn't. She said trust had to be earned, but she added that he could test her, that she would calculate his monthly expenses and show him where he was losing money, for free. If he saw that she was useful, they would come to an agreement. If not, she would leave. Dan agreed. Ella spent 2 days calculating. She went through every coin Dan had spent, every purchase, every order. By the evening of the second day, she sat down across from him and placed a sheet of paper with numbers on the table. Dan was buying sand at the market. He was overpaying by double. The middleman bought it from a quarry on the outskirts for copper coins and sold it for silver. Ella found the quarry. We can buy directly, a savings of 3 silver coins a week. Dan bought firewood from the first woodcutter he came across. Ella found out that the Lumberjacks Guild across the bridge sells at a volume discount, savings of another 2 silver coins. Dan didn't keep track of orders. 3 customers hadn't paid yet. Ella made a list of debtors. Total debt, 4 gold coins. Dan listened and felt like an idiot. He could turn sand into crystal but couldn't calculate his own profit. Ella finished and looked at him. She waited. Dan thought. Then he stood up. He went to the workshop. Ella sat and waited. An hour later, Dan returned and placed an object on the table in front of her. A wooden frame. Inside were rows of thin wires strung with beads. 9 rows, 10 beads in each. Ella looked at the object. She asked what it was. Dan said, an abacus. He showed her how to move the beads, how to add, subtracting, multiplying. Ella took the abacus in her hands. She tried it. She added 2 numbers, then 3. Then she multiplied. Her fingers moved faster and faster. 10 minutes later, she was calculating on the abacus faster than in her head. Her eyes were shining. She looked up. Dan said he'd made it for her, because she was the best economist he'd ever met. He said it wasn't a decoration, it was a tool, not meant to be worn, to be used. Ella looked at him. Her lips trembled. She clutched the abacus with both hands, pressed them to her chest, for a second, then set them on the table. She straightened up. She said the terms were as follows: 10% of net profits, full control over purchasing and sales, and an office in the neighborhood, not in the hayloft. Dan held out his hand. Ella shook it, firmly, businesslike, but Dan noticed that she had taken the abacus from the table and pressed it to her chest as she left. With Ella, everything changed. In the first week, she collected debts from 3 clients. She switched sand procurement to a direct contract with the quarry. She negotiated with a team of lumberjacks. She found a potter's widow at the far end of the block who knew where to get the best clay. Ella worked like a machine, without emotion, without hesitation. Every decision calculated, every penny counted. Dan could finally just work, stand at the furnace, blow glass, teach Hana, experiment. He started making lenses, simple magnifying glasses, convex, hand-polished with fine sand. The first lens was rough. It magnified about 1.5 times. But when the apothecary saw it, he nearly fell over. He asked how it worked. Dan explained that glass of a certain shape refracts light. The apothecary said it was magic. Dan said it was physics. The pharmacist didn't know the word physics. Dan said it was the science of how things work. The pharmacist bought the lens for 2 gold coins. He ordered 3 more. Hana was growing, not in height, in skill. By the end of the 2nd month, she was making clay cups that Dan could sell. Not as a master's work, as sturdy tableware, even, smooth, with the right proportions. Dan began teaching her how to glaze. He showed her how to make a simple glaze from ash and clay, how to apply it, how to fire it. Hana listened, soaking up every word. She didn't ask questions. She did. She tried. She made mistakes. She reworked them. And with each attempt, there were fewer mistakes. One evening, Dan found a cup on the table that he hadn't made. Simple. White glaze with a slight gray tint. But the shape was flawless. The proportions were precise to the millimeter. And inside, at the bottom, was a small imprint. A flower. 5 petals. Hana had pressed it with the tip of a stick. Dan turned the cup over in his hands. He placed it on the shelf next to his best pieces. In the morning, Hana saw it and stopped in the doorway. Dan was working at the kiln and didn't turn around, but he could hear her standing there, and how she exhaled quietly afterward. Ella brought the news in the 3rd month. She was sitting at the table in the workshop, sorting coins into piles. She looked up and said a man had come to the neighborhood. Not a customer, an observer. He stood on the street corner, watching the workshop, the line at the door, the carts of sand. Then he left. Ella described him. A gray cloak, a silver brooch shaped like a set of scales. Dan didn't recognize the symbol. Orwin did. The old man turned pale. He said the scales were the emblem of the Alchemists' Guild. He said that if the guild had sent an observer, it meant they'd taken notice. It meant they didn't like it. Dan asked how he was getting in their way. Orwin looked at him as if he were a child. He said that Dan made things without gold. Good things. Better than the guilds. Cheaper than the guilds. This wasn't just competition. It was heresy. The Alchemists' Guild controlled everything related to artifacts and valuable items in Velmar. Their monopoly rested on a single assertion. A truly valuable item must contain gold. Without gold, it is impossible to create anything of worth. It is a law. It is a dogma. It is the foundation of the entire kingdom's economy. And every day, Dan proves that this is a lie. With every vial, with every mirror, with every bar of soap. Dan listened. He nodded. Inside, he felt cold. He wasn't afraid of competition. He was afraid of what lay behind the competition in a world without antitrust laws or a police force. He recalled stories of medieval guilds on Earth, how they destroyed outsiders, how they smashed machines, how they burned down workshops, how they killed those who broke the guild rules. And here, they also had magic. Dan didn't wait. He gathered his people. That evening, 5 of them were sitting in Orvin's workshop. Dan, Ella, Hana, Greg, and Bert, who came because Ella said the situation was serious. Dan told them about the observer. Bert cursed. He said that's how the guild starts. First they watch, then they warn, then they strike. 30 years ago, his uncle made paint without a guild license. First, they pulled and offered him a guild membership for 200 gold pieces. His uncle refused. A week later, his workshop burned down. A month later, he himself disappeared. Bert said this calmly, as if talking about the weather. Greg slammed his fist on the table, his only fist. He said he wouldn't let them burn down the neighborhood. Hana sat quietly. Her face was pale. Ella took out her abacus and placed it on the table. She said panic wouldn't help. She said they needed to think. What tools of pressure did the guild have? Legal, economic, physical? And what tools did they have? Dan looked at her. Ella was counting, not coins. Risks, threats, options. Her brain worked just like Dan's hands, precisely and without wasted motion. They talked until midnight. Ella proposed 3 steps. First, legalization. Dan must obtain a trade license, not a guild badge, but a simple city license for a craft. It costs 5 gold pieces and grants the right to trade within Vespera. The guild cannot prohibit a licensed artisan from working, only a court, and court is long and expensive. Step 2, patronage. We need someone on top, someone from the nobility or the court, someone whose name will make the guild think twice before setting a workshop on fire. Step 3, speed. The faster Dan expands, the harder it is to destroy him. 1 workshop can be burned down, 10 is harder. Dan nodded. The plan was good. But a patron? Where to find a patron? Ella said she knew where. Lady Merritt, a merchant's wife. She has connections at court. If Merritt put in a good word with the right people, someone might be found. Dan agreed. In the morning, Ella left for Merritt's. While Ella was away, Dan worked. He was finishing up orders, and at the same time, working on something new, a ceramic water filter. The idea was simple: porous ceramic, fired at a specific temperature. The pores were small enough to trap dirt and large impurities, large enough to let water through. On Earth, ceramic filters were used in developing countries. Cheap, effective, they saved lives. In Vesper, people drank water from city wells. Half the illnesses in the lower city came from dirty water: dysentery, intestinal infections, cholera. Dan didn't know the exact names of the local diseases, but he saw the symptoms. He saw how children in the slums suffered from stomach aches. He saw pale faces and sunken eyes. Dirty water, the simplest killer and the easiest to defeat. Dan made 3 filters in 2 days. Clay pots with double bottoms. Between the bottoms, a layer of fired porous ceramic. You pour water in from the top. You wait. Clean water flows out from the bottom. He took 1 filter to Bert. Bert tried it. He poured water from the well. Murky, smelly. An hour later, clear water flowed from the bottom spout. Odorless. Bert tasted it. Then he poured a mug and drank it. Then he poured another. Then he looked at Dan. He said that for 30 years his guests had complained of stomach aches after drinking the water. Every week. Someone. Always. He asked how much this thing cost. Dan said 10 silver coins. Bert said he'd take 3. 1 for the kitchen, 1 for the living room, and 1 as a spare. Dan took the second filter to the orphanage on the outskirts of the neighborhood. A small house where 6 orphans lived under the care of an old woman named Ketra. Dan had seen this house during his 2nd week in Vesper. He'd walked past it. He'd heard children crying. He'd peeked inside. 5 children, aged 3 to 10, were lying on ragged mattresses. 2 had fevers. Ketra sat nearby, changing the wet rags on their foreheads. The water in the bucket was murky. Dan couldn't do anything then. Now he could. He set the filter on the table in the shelter. He showed Ketra how to use it. The old woman listened skeptically. Then she tasted the water that had passed through the filter. Clear. Clean. Ketra looked at Dan. She asked how much. Dan said it was free. Ketra didn't argue. She didn't thank him. She just nodded and said she'd remember. Ella returned 3 days later, with news. Mrs. Merritt had spoken to the right people, and one of those people turned out to be a chamberlain at the court of Princess Solvig, King Velmar's 3rd daughter. Merritt said that Princess Solvig was interested in reforms, that she wasn't like her sisters, that she read trade reports at breakfast and argued with the treasurer at dinner, and that the chamberlain had passed on to the princess a rumor about a master from the lower city who worked wonders with mud. The princess was intrigued. Merritt said it was possible, just possible. The princess would want to see the workshop. Dan exhaled. This was a chance, not just a patron, royal blood. But the guild didn't wait. One night toward the end of the 3rd month, Dan woke to the smell of smoke, not from a stove. Bitter, acrid. He jumped up, ran out into the street. The soap factory was on fire. The fire had already broken through the roof and was creeping up the walls. Red flames and black smoke in the night sky. Greg ran out of his smithy with a bucket. Dan ran to the well. Hannah emerged from the darkness, barefoot, wearing only a shirt. They hauled water and poured it on the fire. It was useless. The soap factory was small and dry. Wood and straw. It burned down in an hour. By morning, all that remained were blackened walls and a charred cauldron. Dan stood before the ruins. His hands were black with soot. His face was wet with sweat. Greg stood nearby. He was silent. Hannah sat on the ground and stared into the fire. Ella arrived at dawn. She looked at the ruins, then at Dan. She said quietly, "It's begun." Dan clenched his teeth. He looked at his hands. They had built this soap factory. They could build a new one. But first, they had to make sure the next one wasn't burned down. He turned to Ella. He said they needed a princess, urgently. Ella nodded. Princess Solvig of Velmar arrived to the artisans' quarter a week after the fire, without warning, without an entourage, just a chamberlain and 2 guards in plain cloaks. Dan learned of the visit when Hannah burst into the workshop, eyes wide, and said there was a woman standing in the street whom the guards wouldn't leave for a moment. Dan went out. Solvig stood by the charred walls of the soap boiler and was running her finger along the charred doorframe. She wore a simple, unadorned, dark blue dress. Her hair was pulled back into a bun. Her face was calm, cold, like a porcelain mask. She turned toward Dan. She looked at him. Dan could see that she was assessing him, just as Ella had assessed the workshop on the first day. Quickly, precisely, without unnecessary emotion. Solveig asked who had set the fire. Dan said he didn't know for sure, but that a guild observer had been spotted a week before the fire. Solveig nodded. She wasn't surprised. She asked what was in the soap factory. Dan explained, about the soap, about the technology, about how lye made from beechwood ash and pork fat produced a product better than the guilds at 1/3 of the price. Solveig listened. Then she asked to see the workshop, the glass one, the main one. Dan led her inside. Orvin was sitting on his box. He saw the princess and tried to stand up. He coughed. Solveig walked over to him. She told him he didn't need to stand up. She said it so quietly that Dan could barely hear her. Then she turned to the shelves. Vials, vases, glasses, stained glass, mirrors in wooden frames, lenses on a velvet cloth. She picked up a lens, looked through it at her palm. The lines on her skin doubled in size. Solveig turned the lens, put it back. She picked up a mirror, looked into it, for a long time. Then she set it down, her face expressionless. She asked what everything was made of. Dan listed them. Sand, ash, lime, tin, clay, wood. Not a drop of gold. Not a gram of silver. Not a single enchanted crystal. Solveig was silent for a moment. Then she asked how much the guild's equivalent of each item cost. Ella stepped forward. She had been waiting for this question. She had a list prepared. The price of each of Dan's items next to the price of the guild equivalent. The mirror, 3 gold pieces versus 20. The set of vials, 12 silver pieces versus 6 gold pieces. The lens, 2 gold pieces. There are no guild lenses, no equivalents. Ella read the figures in an even voice. Solveig listened. Her face remained impassive, but Dan noticed her fingers tremble when Ella reached the line about ceramic water filters. 10 silver, no guild equivalent. Water filtration doesn't exist at all, as a service or a product. Solveig turned to Dan. She asked about the filter. Dan explained, simply, without scientific terms. He said that dirty water passes through porous clay, and the dirt remains in the pores while clean water flows out from the bottom. He said that half the illnesses in the lower city come from the water. He said that the filter costs 10 silver and lasts a year. Solveig asked to see it. Dan poured water from a bucket, murky, yellowish. 10 minutes later, clear water flowed from the lower tap. Solveig took a mug of clean water, looked at the light, set it down, didn't drink it, but Dan could see what she wanted. Solveig went out onto the street. She stood there for a minute. She looked at the neighborhood, at the workshops, at the smoke from Greg's smithy, at the burned-out soap factory, at Hannah, who was standing by the door, clasping her hands. Then she turned to Dan. She said she had questions. 3 questions. First, could Dan scale up production? Make not 10 mirrors a week, but 100. Not 3 filters, but 300. Dan said he could. If there were people in workshops. The technology is simple. It's teachable. Any smart apprentice could master it in a month. Second question. Could he train other masters? Not just one or two, but dozens, all across the kingdom. Dan said he could. But for that, he'd need a school, a place, protection. Third question. Is he ready for the alchemist's guild to declare war on him? Not just setting fire to a soap factory, a real war, with accusations of heresy, with a trial, with possible arrest, with assassination attempts. Dan was silent. Then he said he wasn't ready, that he was a craftsman, not a warrior, that he didn't know how to fight and was afraid of blood, but that he wouldn't back down, because the children at Ketra's orphanage hadn't had stomach aches since he installed the filter, and that was worth any war. Solvi looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. She said she would take his workshop under her patronage, officially, at court. She said it wasn't generosity, it was an investment. Velmar is suffocating. The gold veins are dry. The treasury is cracking. The imperial tithe is choking the borderlands. If Dan can create value from what lies underfoot, then this is an opportunity for the entire kingdom. Dan bowed, awkwardly. He had never bowed before. Solvi smiled slightly. For the first time during the entire visit, she said there was no need to bow. She said it would be better to make her a water filter for the palace, because the water in the palace is no better than in the lower city. Dan chuckled. He said he would do it. Solvi left. The chamberlain stayed behind. He said the patent would be finalized by tomorrow morning, 5 gold pieces at the princess's expense. That night, Dan couldn't sleep. He sat on the threshold of the workshop. The stars above Vesper were large and unfamiliar, foreign constellations, a foreign sky. But the smell of clay dust was the same. Hana came out of the workshop, quietly, barefoot. She sat down beside him. She was silent. Then she said she was proud of him. Dan turned. Hana was looking straight ahead, not at him, at the stars. She said it so quietly that he almost didn't hear her. Then she stood up and went back inside. Dan sat there and thought. 3 months, from a puddle on the pavement to the princess's patronage, from a lump of clay to a workshop with a line out the door. He had built something, not a thing, something more. And tomorrow, a real war would begin over that something. He wasn't ready, but his hands were. That would be enough. The 4th month began with construction. Dan was restoring the soap factory. Greg was forging hinges and brackets for the new door. Hana was mixing mortar. Ella found a carpenter who put on a new roof for 3 silver coins and a meal. Dan rebuilt the furnace. He didn't just fix it, he rebuilt it. He made the firebox wider. The chimney was already there. He added a second tier for simultaneous drying and firing. The kiln now gave off even heat and held it twice as long. The soap workshop was up and running in 10 days. But now the soap was different. Dan experimented for 2 weeks. He found flaxseed oil at the market. He added it to the recipe. The soap became softer. He found dried lavender at the herbalist's. He ground it into a powder. He added it to the mixture before molding. The soap smelled, not of grease and lye, of lavender. Bert sniffed the first bar of the new soap and said his wife would kill him for such a bar. Dan said he would make a separate bar for Bert's wife, with mint, but someone had to run the soap kitchen. Dan couldn't stand at 2 stoves at once. Ella found a solution. A woman named Rita, the widow of a soap maker from the neighboring district. Her husband had made soap for the guild for 20 years. He knew the process. After his death, the guild took away his license and equipment. Rita was left with nothing. She worked as a laundress. Ella brought her to the soap factory. Dan showed her his recipe. Rita watched. She was silent. Then she said that her husband had made soap differently. Worse, more lye, less fat. The soap was cheap and harsh. It burned the skin. But the guild demanded it that way. Cheaper to produce, more profit. Quality didn't concern the customer. Rita ran her hand over the new soap. Soft, smooth. It smelled of lavender. She asked if she could try making a batch herself. Dan nodded. Rita made it. The first attempt was a bit rough. Too much ash in the lye. The soap turned out hard. The second attempt was better. The third was almost perfect. Rita was a good soap maker. She'd just never been allowed to make good soap. Dan set her pay, a silver coin a day plus a tenth of the sales. Rita nodded. Her lips were trembling. Dan turned away. He was already used to people here crying when they were given a chance. At the same time, Dan started a pottery workshop, an old pottery studio with a collapsed roof. Greg and a carpenter repaired the roof in 4 days. Dan restored the kiln. Hannah moved there. It was her home now. Dan taught her everything he knew about clay. Kaolin for fine porcelain, red clay for coarse tableware, fire clay for heat-resistant dishes. Hannah absorbed it all like a sponge. But her main talent wasn't technique, it was her sense of form. She saw proportions. She saw where a line should curve, where a wall should thin out, where an edge should turn inward. She made things you wanted to hold in your hands. Dan saw this and said nothing. He didn't praise her. He didn't criticize her. He simply placed her best pieces on the shelf next to his own. Hannah noticed, and every time, her back straightened just a little. A girl came to Dan, not a client, a wanderer, barefoot, in a leather jacket over a canvas shirt, dark, tangled hair, 3 dozen pouches and vials on her belt, the smell of herbs and something mushroom-like. She entered the workshop and stopped at the threshold. She looked around. She walked over to the shelf with colored glass. She picked up a green vial. She sniffed it, put it down. She took a blue one. She looked at it in the light. She put it down. She turned to Dan. She said she needed glass bottles, lots of them, different sizes, with airtight stoppers, for tinctures and ointments. Dan asked who she was. Maya Chen, an herbalist. She's been traveling for 3 years. She gathers plants, mushrooms, roots, makes medicine, sells it at markets. She asked how much the jars cost. Dan named a price. Maya did the math in her head. She said it was expensive, that she didn't have much money, that she was used to storing tinctures in wooden bottles and leather flasks. Dan asked why she needed glass ones. Maya said that wood absorbs odors, that leather lets air through, that her 3 best tinctures had gone bad on the road because the containers were no good. Dan nodded. He looked at her more closely. Pouches on her belt, dozens of them, different sizes, tied on haphazardly. Some were coming undone. One bottle was plugged with a rag. Another was wrapped in rope. Maya noticed his gaze. She frowned. Dan asked if she was right-handed or left-handed. Maya said she was left-handed. She asked what difference it made. Dan didn't answer. He asked what kind of knife she was hiding behind her back. Maya froze. Her hand twitched toward her waist. Then it stopped. She looked at Dan warily, like a small animal, ready to run. Dan said calmly that he could see the hilt behind her belt, that the knife was short, for herbs, not for fighting, that there was no need to hide it. Maya was silent. Then she said that in cities, people didn't like it when strangers walked around with knives. Dan said it was okay in his workshop. He asked Maya to wait. He went to a corner where leather scraps lay that he'd bought from a leather worker at the market. In 2 hours, Dan made a belt, a wide one, made of double-layered leather, with 3 dozen small pockets and loops, each pocket sized for a specific bottle, loops for pouches of herbs, fasteners on every pocket so nothing would fall out while walking, and 1 hidden pocket on the left, in the back, under the left arm, for a knife, with a quick-release fastener. Dan handed the belt to Maya. She unwrapped it. She was silent for a long time. She tried it on. The belt fit perfectly. Every pocket was in its place. Her left hand could easily reach any of them. Her right hand reached the rest. The knife fit into the secret pocket like a glove. The handle didn't stick out. It didn't get in the way. But her hand found it instantly. Maya stood in the middle of the workshop in her new belt and didn't move. Then she said quietly, "It was made for her." Dan said yes. He said he'd noticed she was hiding the knife behind her back and that she could wear it normally. Maya looked at him. Her eyes were shining. She blinked quickly. She turned away. Then she asked a bit gruffly how much the belt and the vials cost. Dan said the belt was free and she could pay some other way. Maya asked how. Dan said he needed someone who knew about herbs, plants, mushrooms, how natural materials interact with each other. He needed additives for glazes, plant-based dyes, medicinal herbs for firing into ceramics, antiseptic solutions for impregnation. If Maya agreed to work with him, the jars were hers. Everything she needed, as much as she needed, whenever she needed it. Maya bit her lip. She thought. Then she asked where she could pitch a tent. Dan said there was no need for a tent, that there was an empty room in the neighborhood above a tanner's workshop. Maya said she was used to sleeping on the ground. Dan said the ground wasn't going anywhere, but a roof was better. Maya snorted. She almost smiled. She said she'd give it a try. She left. An hour later, she returned with a bundle on her back. All she had in this world. A bundle and a belt. The 5th month. The artisan's quarter had changed. Dan stood on the roof of Orvin's workshop and looked down. Smoke rose from 3 chimneys, the glassworks, the pottery, the soap factory. Greg was hammering, steadily, confidently. The anvil clamp gleamed from constant use. Rita was singing in the soap factory. She had a rich, low voice. Hannah was working in the pottery, quietly, intently. Maya was drying herbs on ropes strung between the houses. Green bundles swayed in the wind and smelled of mint and thyme. Ella sat at a table in the former tannery, which they had converted into an office. She was counting. She was always counting. Dan climbed down from the roof. He had something important to do. The old man had come by last night, skinny as a stick, clothes in tatters, shoes worn down to holes. He stood at the workshop door, crumpling a hat in his hands. Dan approached. The old man was silent. Then he pulled a rag from his bosom. He unfolded it. Inside lay a ring, gold, thin, old, with a crack running all the way around, almost broken in half. The old man said it was his wife's wedding ring, that she had died 40 years ago, that the ring was the only thing left, that it had cracked last winter when he fell on the ice, that he wore it on a string around his neck, that he had gone to 3 jewelers. They all said there wasn't enough gold, that the repair would cost more than the ring itself, that it would be easier to melt it down and make a new one. The old man said he didn't need a new one. He needed this one, her. He asked if Dan could fix it. He said he had nothing to pay with. Dan took the ring. Light. Warm from the old man's body. Low-carat gold mixed with copper. A clean crack. Not a break, but metal fatigue. The ring had been worn for 50 years. It was worn out. Dan looked at the old man. He asked what his wife's name was. The old man said Nella. Dan nodded. He told the old man to come back in 2 days. He worked for 2 days straight, almost without sleep. Greg helped with the soldering. Dan heated the ring to the right temperature. He didn't melt it, he heated. Carefully brought the edges of the crack together. He soldered them with the thinnest layer of gold he'd begged from the apothecary. The man kept a pinch of gold powder for medicines. Dan took it in exchange for 3 mirrors. The ring was whole again. The crack was gone. But Dan didn't stop there. He took the thinnest engraving tool he had, a needle made of hardened steel, and he began to engrave. Inside the ring, letters, a name, Nella. But not just a name. Dan spent the whole evening trying to figure out the handwriting. He walked around the neighborhood, asked the old man's neighbors, found an old woman who remembered Nella, who had received letters from her, who had kept 1 letter in a trunk for 40 years. The old woman pulled out a yellowed sheet of paper. Dan looked at the letters, round, soft, with a distinctive curl on the letter H. He memorized it. He returned to the workshop and engraved the name in the handwriting that Nella herself had used when she was alive. The old man came on the 3rd day. Dan handed him the ring. The old man slipped it onto his finger. He looked at it. No cracks. The ring was like new, but better than new, because it was old, because it was the one. Then Dan told him to look inside. The old man took the ring off. He held it up to his eyes. He saw the engraving, Nella, in her handwriting, by her hand. He stood there, motionless. Dan saw his fingers turn white as they clenched the ring. The old man didn't cry. He slowly sank to his knees, touched his forehead to the floor, and stayed that way. Dan stood there and said nothing. Hannah stood in the doorway and said nothing. Maya stopped by the window outside and said nothing. A minute later, the old man stood up, put the ring on, looked at Dan, nodded, and walked out. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. By the end of the week, the whole neighborhood knew about the ring, then the entire lower city. People said there was a craftsman who made things just the way he liked. Not expensive, not made of gold, but just the way he liked. Dan didn't realize that this particular story would change everything, but it did. 3 days after the ring incident, Irene Moore came to the workshop. Dan heard heavy footsteps at the door and turned around. A tall woman, broad shoulders, short hair with gray at the temples, a stern face, a scar across her left eyebrow, eyes gray and empty. She was holding something long, wrapped in cloth. She placed it on the table, unwrapped it. A sword, broken. The blade snapped in two just past the hilt. The steel was dull. The hilt was wrapped in cracked leather. A coat of arms on the pommel, faded, almost indistinguishable. Irene said it was her family's sword, that it had served 4 generations, that it had broken in battle 2 years ago, that 3 blacksmiths said it was impossible to reforge, that the steel was dead. Dan picked up the fragments. He looked at the break. He ran his finger along the edge. The steel wasn't dead. It had been tempered incorrectly. Too hard, brittle, overheated. Someone had once tempered this blade in cold water instead of oil, making it ringing but brittle, like glass. Dan looked at Irene. He asked why she needed the sword. Irene was silent for a moment. Then she said it wasn't for battle. She said she didn't want to fight anymore. Dan asked then why. Irene said it was the last thing left of her unit, 8 people, all dead, because of the command that sent them into an ambush. Irene survived. The sword didn't. She's been carrying the shards for 2 years. Can't throw them away. She can't fix it. Dan nodded. He worked on the sword for 3 days. Greg helped. They heated the shards in the forge, not until they were white hot, just dark red. They smoothed out the breaks, forged them back together, slowly, carefully, without rushing. Dan monitored the temperature by the metal's color, dark cherry for forging, light red for normalizing, quenching in oil, not in water, in oil, slow cooling. The steel became tough, resilient, not brittle. The blade came to life. But Dan changed it. He removed the old guard, massive, heavy, designed for 2-handed chopping strikes. He put on a new one, lightweight, with forward curving crossguards that protected the hand, a guard for defense, not for attack. And he reworked the hilt, made it thinner, lighter, wrapped it in fresh leather, left space for the thumb so the grip would be more comfortable for the right hand. But he shifted the balance slightly toward the pommel, took the strain off the wrist. Dan saw how Irene moved her right hand. He saw how she winced at a certain angle. An old injury, a fracture or a sprain, not fully healed. A heavy sword balanced on the blade would have destroyed that wrist in a month. A light one balanced on the hilt could be carried without pain. Irene came for the sword. Dan set it on the table. Irene picked it up, lifted it with one hand. Her eyes widened, light. She gripped it, tested the grip. Her thumb fit perfectly into the recess. Her wrist didn't ache. She looked at the guard, new, different. She looked at Dan. He said he'd removed the old guard because it was getting in her way. He said he'd lightened the hilt because she had an injury to her right wrist. He said this sword was for defense, not to kill. Irene stood with the sword in her hand. The blade didn't tremble. Her hand didn't tremble, but her chin trembled. She clenched her jaw, swallowed, then asked briefly, "How much?" Dan said, "Nothing." Irene said she didn't accept charity. Dan said it wasn't charity. He said he needed someone to guard the neighborhood, the workshops, the people. That the guild had already set fire to the soap factory and that things would get worse. That he was a craftsman and didn't know how to defend. Irene looked at him. Then she lowered the sword. She nodded. She said one word. Accepted. The 6th month. Dan stood in the pottery workshop, holding a small bowl in his hands. White clay, fired at a high temperature, Inside, dried herbs were pressed and sealed. Maya stood nearby, biting her nail. She had gathered these herbs a week ago. Elderberry, yarrow, willow bark. All three have antipyretic and anti-inflammatory properties. Back on Earth, Dan knew this from his interest in fermentation and herbal medicine. Willow bark contains salicin, natural aspirin. Elderberry stimulates sweating. Yarrow reduces inflammation. The challenge was delivery. How to ensure the herbs release their compounds into the water while remaining protected from spoilage and not requiring daily brewing. Dan came up with a solution: to bake the herbs inside porous ceramic. At the right temperature, the clay would harden but remain porous. The herbs inside would dry out and partially char, but their active compounds remain within the clay's structure. When you pour hot water into the bowl, the water passes through the pores, washing out the compounds. The result is neither tea nor an infusion. It's medicine, slowly released from the bowl's walls with each use. One bowl lasts a month. Dan poured hot water into the bowl. Wait a moment. He tasted it. A slightly bitter aftertaste of willow bark, a light floral scent of elderberry. It works. Maya tried it too. She grimaced. She said it was bitter. Then she said it was stronger than her decoction made from the same herbs, and that it worked faster. She could feel it. Herbalists can sense such things. Dan set the bowl on the table. It was the first artifact. Not gold, not magical. Clay, with charred herbs inside. Effective against colds and fevers. The cost of materials: a handful of clay, a pinch of herbs, an hour of work. Dan called it a healing bowl. Maya said the name was silly. Dan agreed, but the name stuck. He made 10 bowls in 3 days, 5 with a fever-reducing mixture, 3 with a soothing one. Lemon balm, valerian, motherwort. 2 with an antiseptic, for gargling and washing wounds. Sage, chamomile, thyme. Maya tested each bowl on herself. She tasted the water. She assessed the concentration. She adjusted the formula. They worked together. Dan knew ceramics. Maya knew herbs. Together they created something this world had never seen before. Medicine in the wall of a cup. Ella looked at the first batch. She did the math. If sold for a silver coin apiece, it would be cheaper than any potion from a guild alchemist. 10 times cheaper. And it works just as well, maybe even better, because the guild's potions are gold-based, expensive, rare, accessible only to the wealthy. But this cup is made of clay and herbs, accessible to everyone. News of the healing cup spread quickly, too quickly. Ella had warned that they needed to keep it quiet, that they couldn't attract the guild's attention. But it was too late. The apothecary told the merchant told his wife, the wife told her friends. Within a week, all of Vesper was talking about the bowls. And the guild heard. Master Sylvester Voen learned about the bowls over lunch. His assistant, Rand, reported it. He said that a heretic from the lower quarter was now making healing items without gold, that he was selling them for silver, that people were buying them, that the line at the workshop was 3 times longer than it had been a month ago. Voen listened. He ate. He wiped his mouth with a napkin. He asked if the bowls worked. Rand said that, judging by the reviews, they did. The merchant's wife, Marette, had cured her migraine. 2 maids from the tavern had recovered from colds in a day instead of a week. A child from the orphanage had stopped coughing. Voen put down his fork. He leaned back in his chair. He was tall, thin. His face was carved from stone. Gray temples, eyes blue and cold as a winter lake. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man carrying a burden of responsibility he hadn't asked for. Voen said it was worse than mirrors, worse than soap, worse than glass, because mirrors and soap are commodities. But healing bowls are an assault on the central dogma, on the law of the world. Value is born of gold. Healing requires gold. Health is worth its weight in gold. And this boy is molding what heals out of mud. And if people see that they can be healed without gold, they'll ask why gold is needed at all. And then everything will collapse. Not the guild. Everything. Voen stood up. He walked to the window. He looked out at the city, at the gilded domes, at the bank vaults, at the palace spires. He said they needed to act, not with arson. The arson had drawn the princess's attention. No, they needed to be smarter. Rand asked how. Voen said there was an old law, the trial of truth, a public test. The guild has the right to summon any artisan to a contest if his wares are claimed to surpass those of the guild. If the artisan loses, he loses his license and the right to work. If he wins, Voen smirked. He said that no one had ever won. The summons arrived in 3 days. A courier in a silver cloak bearing the guild's crest, an official scroll with a seal. Dan unrolled it and read aloud. The Alchemists' Guild of Velmar summons the artisan known as Dan from the lower quarter to the trial of truth, St. Iron's Square, the day of the summer solstice, in 4 weeks. Dan will pit his best artifact against the guild's best artifact. The city will judge. Ella read the scroll twice. She turned pale. She said it was a trap, that the guild possesses the cup of health, a golden artifact worth a king's fortune. It cures any illness with a single sip, enchanted, infused with mana, works instantly. Against that, a clay bowl of herbs. This isn't a contest, it's a death sentence. Greg slammed his fist on the table. Irene placed her hand on her sword. Hannah turned pale. Maya cursed under her breath in a language no one understood. Orvin coughed in the corner. Dan stood and stared at the scroll. 4 weeks. 4 weeks to do the impossible. He looked at his hands. The same calluses. 12 years. He raised his head, said he would accept the challenge. Ella started to argue. Dan said there was no choice. If he refused, he would lose his patent, lose his workshop, lose everything. This trial was his only chance to end the war with a single blow. Ella fell silent. Then she nodded. She asked what was needed. Dan said he needed 4 weeks of silence. And Maya. Every herb she knows, every single one. And clay, the best clay you can find. And fire, the hottest his kiln can produce. He turned to Hannah, told her to take over all current orders, glass, ceramics, everything. Hannah swallowed. She nodded. Dan turned to Ella. He told her to find information about the cup of health, how it works, what it's made of, what illnesses it cured, what it didn't cure. Ella took out her abacus. Dan turned to Maya. He said he needed her knowledge, her hands, her nose and her tongue and her intuition. Maya straightened up. She said she was ready. Dan nodded. He looked at everyone. 5, 6 with Orvin, 7 with Rita, 8 with Bert, 9 with Irene. Against the most powerful organization in the kingdom. Dan smirked. Back on Earth, he'd started a channel with a $50 camera and a lump of clay he'd picked up at a construction site. Here, he was starting the same way, only the stakes were higher. He clenched his fists. 4 weeks. Let's go. 4 weeks until the trial. Dan closed the workshop door to his workshop and didn't come out for 3 days. He didn't work for the first 2 days, he thought. He sat on the floor among the sacks of clay and stared at the wall. Maya brought food and set it by the door. Hannah took away the empty bowls. No one came in. Dan thought about the cup of health. Ella had dug up the information. A 3-pound gold cup. Hammered gold with fused mana crystals. Created 40 years ago by the guild's best alchemist. It works simply. You pour in water. The gold and mana transform it into a healing elixir. 1 sip reduces fever. 2 sips heal wounds. 3 sips cure illnesses that have lasted for years. Instantly. Spectacularly. Irrefutably. The cost of creation, 1,500 gold pieces. 3 years of work. Dan couldn't compete with this head-on. His clay bowls worked, but slowly. A week, 2, a month, not instant. Compared to the flash of the golden miracle, his bowl would look like a cart next to a thoroughbred horse. He couldn't win on speed. He couldn't win on spectacle. He couldn't win on power, so he had to win at something else. On the 3rd day, Dan got up off the floor. He left the workshop. He approached Maya. He asked what illnesses the cup of health couldn't cure. Maya raised an eyebrow. She said that, according to rumors, the cup couldn't handle lung diseases. Consumption, black lung, anything involving the slow destruction of tissue from within. The cup heals instantly. But instant healing is like a flash, like fire on a wound. It sears and seals it. You can't do that to the lungs. The tissue is too thin, too delicate. The golden elixir strikes it like a hammer on glass. Dan froze. He looked at Maya. He looked toward the workshop. Orvin was coughing there. Every day, every morning, blood on a rag. Orvin was dying, slowly, from lung disease. A glassblower. 40 years at the furnace. Silicon dust. Glass shards. His lungs eaten away from the inside. And even the cup of health wouldn't have helped him. Dan clenched his fists. That's it. Not speed, not flashiness. Precision, care, something for a specific person. The cup heals everyone, but not everyone. Dan will heal everyone, one by one. The one the cup won't help. He worked for 3 weeks, Maya by his side. They went through every herb Maya knew. Coltsfoot for the lungs, plantain for healing, licorice root for soothing, thyme for breathing, elecampane for cleansing, pine resin for protection. Maya would leave at dawn for the woods outside the city. She'd return with a belt full of herbs. She'd dry them, pound them, mix them. Dan worked with clay. He wasn't just sculpting, he was creating a structure. Varying degrees of porosity in different parts of the bowl. The bottom was dense. The walls had medium porosity. The upper rim had large pores for rapid evaporation. The design was different from that of the first healing bowls. Not to drink from it, to breathe. Hot water poured into the bowl passed through the walls saturated with herbs. Steam rose, warm, moist, saturated with medicinal substances. The patient breathed in this steam. The herbs entered the lungs directly, not through the stomach, not through the blood, straight to where it hurts. Inhalation, the simplest principle. Millions of people on Earth have breathed over pots of potatoes. Here, no one had thought of it. Dan made the first prototype in 10 days. A white bowl, wide, shallow, with edges slightly curved inward so the steam wouldn't spread out to the sides but rise upward. Herbs were pressed into the sides, 6 layers, each layer with a different concentration. The lower layers were the most potent. The upper ones were milder. So the first breath wouldn't burn the throat. So the medicine would enter smoothly, like a warm hand. Dan poured in hot water. The steam rose, light, smelling of mint and something else, something warm. Dan called for Orvin. The old man shuffled over, sat down in front of the bowl. Dan told him to breathe, just breathe. Orvin leaned over the bowl, closed his eyes, inhaled, coughing, inhaled again. The coughing eased, 3rd breath, a 4th, no coughing. Orvin was breathing evenly, deeply. For the first time in months, his shoulders straightened. His chest rose and fell without wheezing, without whistling, without pain. He opened his eyes. They were wet, but not from illness. Dan sat nearby and said nothing. Maya stood behind him and was silent too. Orvin breathed. 10 minutes, 15. Then he pulled back. He looked at the bowl. He looked at Dan. He said that for the first time in 2 years, it didn't hurt to breathe. Dan nodded. He said it wouldn't cure him completely, that his lungs were too badly damaged, but that if he breathed like this every day, morning and evening, it would get better. Not right away, gradually, a month, 2, 3. The tissue won't regenerate, but the inflammation will subside. Breathing will become easier. The cough will quiet down. The bleeding will stop. Orvin listened. Then he took the bowl in both hands, pressed it to his chest, like a child. Dan made 12 bowls over the remaining days, each with a different composition, for the lungs, for the joints, for headaches, for insomnia, for children's fevers. Maya checked each one. She sniffed the steam. She tasted the water. She adjusted the herbs. They argued, often, loudly. Maya was stubborn and straightforward. She said what she thought. Dan did too. They clashed like 2 stones, and from these clashes, things were born that neither of them could have created alone. Dan made the last bowl for the trial, taking his time, 2 days for shaping, a day for drying, a day for the first firing, 3 days for soaking in herbs, another firing, and the final touch. Dan took a thin brush and applied a strip of glaze along the rim of the bowl. Blue. That very shade of the morning sky he'd captured in the first vase for the widow. A thin line, the only decoration. The bowl stood on the table, white, simple, warm to the touch, smelling of herbs and fire. Dan looked at it and knew it wasn't perfect. He knew the cup of health was more beautiful, more valuable, more powerful. But the cup healed everyone, and this bowl would heal one person, the one whom the cup cannot help. Dan closed his eyes. He remembered his principle. I don't make a thing, I make a thing for you. The day of the summer solstice, St. Aaron's Square was packed with people. Dan stood behind the scenes by the stone platform and looked at the crowd. Thousands, maybe 3,000. Artisans from the lower city, merchants, the nobility on the balconies, guards along the perimeter. The flags of the Alchemists' Guild above the Eastern Tribune. Golden scales on a silver field. Princess Solveig's flag above the Western one. Azure with a white tower. Dan looked at his hands. They were trembling. Not from fatigue, from fear. He was afraid, honestly, truly. Irene stood beside him, straight as the sword she carried. She placed her hand on his shoulder, heavy, firm. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Hannah stood slightly behind them, pale, lips pressed together. In her hands she held a wooden box with a bowl. Ella stood next to her, running numbers through her mind. You could see it in her eyes. Maya was crouching, chewing on a blade of grass, calm, or pretending to be calm. The herald stepped onto the platform. He announced the trial of truth. He read the rules. Each side presents one object. The object must be crafted by the presenter's own hands. The city decides which object is more worthy, voting by shout. Master Voen stepped onto the platform first, a white robe, a silver chain across his chest. His face was calm, confident. Behind him, 2 apprentices carried the cup of health on a velvet cushion. The crowd gasped. The cup was beautiful. Dan could see it even from where he sat. Pure gold, a warm glow. Mana crystals at the base shimmered blue. Relief on the walls. Grapevines and the rising sun. A work of art and magic. Voen raised the cup above his head. The crowd roared. He placed it on the stone table in the center of the platform. He turned to the audience. He said that the cup of health was created according to canons that have stood for 700 years. Gold and mana, purity and power. This cup has saved lives. This cup heals, instantly, without fail, because it contains gold, because gold is life. The crowd roared in approval. Dan clenched his teeth. He stepped onto the platform. Silence. 3,000 people were watching him. A young man in a work shirt, no robe, no chain, no jewelry. Hands covered in calluses and minor burns. Clay dust on his cuffs. He carried the bowl himself. No cushion, no apprentices. A white bowl with a blue rim. Small, simple. Next to the golden goblet, it looked like a sparrow next to a peacock. Someone in the crowd laughed. Dan set the bowl on the table, next to the goblet. Gold and clay. Voen looked at the bowl. His lips twitched. He smiled almost imperceptibly. Dan saw that smile. Voen was certain of victory, absolutely certain. The herald asked if the parties were ready for the demonstration. Voen nodded. Dan nodded. Voen went first. He poured water from a silver jug into the cup. The mana crystals flashed. The water in the cup glowed gold. The crowd exhaled. Voen raised the cup and scanned the square. He asked if there was anyone sick, if there was anyone who wanted healing. A man stepped out of the crowd. He was lame. One leg was shorter than the other. An old injury. A bone that had healed improperly. Voen held out the cup. The man took 3 sips. A golden light coursed through his body. He shuddered, straightened up, took a step, steady. Without a limp, the crowd roared. The man took another step, then another. He walked across the platform, steady, confident. 20 years of limping, 3 gulps. The crowd roared. Voen stood calmly. The cup in his hand glowed. Dan watched. Inside, he felt empty. It was a miracle. Real. Instant. Golden. Compared to this, he had a clay cup. He closed his eyes. He opened them. He looked into the crowd. He searched. In the front row, behind the guards' backs, a girl, about 10 years old, skinny, pale. She was holding a woman's hand. The woman could barely stand. Her face was gray, her eyes sunken. A cough. Quiet. Constant. A seamstress from the alley next to his block. Dan knew her. He saw her every day when he went to fetch water. He saw her sitting by the window, sewing, slower with each passing week. He saw her daughter bringing her water and bread. Lung disease, like Orvan's, like half the craftsmen in the lower city. Dust, smoke, dampness. A slow death that the cup of health couldn't stop because it struck the lungs like a hammer on glass. Dan caught the girl's gaze. Small eyes, frightened, full of hope that had already almost died. Dan said quietly, so quietly that no one but himself heard, "I know who I'm doing this for." He turned to the table, took the bowl, set it before him, began to work. Not to show off, to work. Slowly, calmly. He poured hot water from the clay teapot he had brought with him. Steam rose, thin, fragrant, herbal, not golden, not sparkling. Quiet. The square was silent. 3,000 people watched the steam rising from the clay cup and did not understand. Voen stood and waited. His face showed condescension. Dan raised the cup, stepped down from the platform, walked through the parting crowd, to the front row, to the girl, to her mother. The crowd was silent. Dan stopped in front of the seamstress. He looked at her. She looked at him. Her eyes were clouded with pain. Dan told her to breathe. Just breathe. The woman looked at the cup, at the steam. She leaned in. She inhaled. She coughed. Her daughter grabbed her by the elbow. Dan told her to breathe again. The woman inhaled a second time. The cough was gentler. A third time, more even. A fourth. A fifth. She was breathing. A minute. 2. 3. The square was silent. 3,000 people watched the woman breathing over the clay bowl. Nothing happened. There was no golden light. There was no flash. There was no miracle. There was a woman, and steam, and silence. Then the woman straightened up, slowly. Her eyes cleared. She took a breath, deep, full, without a cough, without wheezing, without pain. Her first full breath in 6 months. Her daughter watched. Her mouth was open. The woman took another breath. Then she looked at her daughter. She raised her hand. She stroked her hair. The square was silent. For a second. 2. Then someone clapped. One person. In the silence, the clap sounded like a hammer blow. Then a second clap. A third. 10. 20. The square roared, not with shouts, with a rumble. Deep. Heavy. Dan stood with the bowl in his hands, motionless. He looked at the girl. She looked at him, then at her mother, then at him again, and she smiled. Subtly, tremblingly. Dan nodded to her. The ovation didn't subside. It grew. It rolled across the square in waves. Voen stood on the platform, and his expression changed. The condescension was gone. Understanding had set in. He was losing. Not in strength, not in speed, not in brilliance. He was losing at something he couldn't measure. The crowd wasn't comparing the cup and the bowl. The crowd was looking at the woman who was breathing, at the girl who was smiling, at the master who had stepped down from the platform and stood next to the sick woman. The cup had healed the lame man, instantly, beautifully. But the lame man was an extra. He had been pulled from the crowd at random, for a demonstration. The chalice was made for a specific person, for this woman, for her lungs, for her daughter. And everyone in the crowd felt it. The herald raised his hands. He called for silence. He asked who would vote for the Alchemist's Guild Cup of Health. A shout rose from the eastern stands. The nobility, merchants, Guild masters. Loudly, powerfully. The herald nodded. He asked who was voting for the artisan's chalice from the lower quarter. The shout came from everywhere, from below, from the ground, from the back rows, from the alleys, from the rooftops. Artisans, laundresses, water carriers, day laborers, children, old people. The shout was not louder, it was broader, deeper. It came from the place where people live, not merely exist. The herald stood and listened. He was an experienced man. He could hear the difference. He turned toward the platform. He announced that, according to the tradition of the trial of truth, the decision would be made by a majority vote. A majority in favor of the chalice. The square erupted. Dan stood below among the people and did not move. Hannah was crying behind him. Ella was counting something in her head, and tears were streaming down her cheeks too, though she didn't notice. Maya was crouching, and for the first time smiling so widely that all her teeth were visible. Irene stood with her hand on her sword and nodded, slowly, approvingly. Greg raised his single fist into the air. On the platform, Voen stood motionless, white as his robe. His arms hung at his sides. He wasn't looking at Dan. He was looking at the crowd, at the faces, at the people who were cheering for the clay cup over the golden goblet, at the world changing right before him. Then he saw something that made him close his eyes. His daughter, Lily. She was standing in the crowd, not on the noble's tribune, down below, among the artisans. She was making her way toward the platform, toward the table, toward the spot where Dan had placed his cup. Lily climbed the steps. She approached the table. She placed her hand next to the cup. She turned to her father. Voen looked at her, his daughter, 17 years old, quiet, frail, raised in a gilded cage. For the first time in her life, standing not beside him, but opposite him. Lily said she was staying here, quietly, steadily, without a tremor in her voice. Vane didn't answer. He stood there. Then he turned around. He stepped down from the platform. The apprentices took the cup. The crowd parted. Vane walked across the square, and not a single person touched him. He didn't insult them. He didn't shout after them. He walked in a silence that was worse than any scream. Dan climbed onto the platform. He approached Lily. She was looking at him. Her eyes were large, dark, frightened by what she had just done. Dan said nothing. He simply stood beside her. They stood like that until the sun sank behind the rooftops of Vesper. The evening sky rose over the city, warm, reddish, like clay in a kiln. Princess Solveig came to the workshop the next day, this time with a chamberlain and a secretary. She said that the trial had changed the situation, that the guild had lost face, that Magister Voen had not formally broken the law, but his position at court had weakened, that the king had noticed, that the council had noticed, that other cities had noticed. Solveig placed a scroll bearing the royal seal on the table, a decree establishing the Guild of New Masters, an official organization of artisans working outside the gold standard, under the patronage of the crown, with the right to trade, with the right to teach, with the right to protection. Dan read the decree. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from something else. He looked at Solveig. She stood with her back straight and a stony face, but Dan noticed how she lightly touched the edge of the table where her cup stood with her finger. That very tea set he had made for her a month ago. White porcelain with delicate blue painting, worth nothing on the market, belonging only to her. Solveig caught his gaze. Her stony face flinched, for a second, then it returned. She nodded, said she would be waiting for him at court in a week, to be presented to the king. She turned and left. Lily stayed in the neighborhood. Dan gave her a room above the soap factory, small, clean, with a window facing the courtyard. Lily sat on the bed and looked at her hands, hands that had never done anything. She asked Dan to teach her something, anything. Dan asked what she could do. Lily said she played the lute. That was all. Dan asked her to play. Lily took the lute out of its case, an old one, with gilded pegs, beautiful, but with a flat, dull sound. She played. Dan listened. The music was beautiful, sad, precise. Her fingers moved with confidence, but the sound wasn't right. The lute was expensive and bad. The top was too heavy. The body was curved wrong. The gilded pegs added weight and muffled the resonance. Dan said he would make her a new lute. Lily said there was no need, that this lute was a gift from her mother. Dan said he wouldn't take the old one. He would make another one. For her. Lily looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. Dan worked on the lute for a week. He found a piece of maple at the carpenter's stall in the market. Old, dry, seasoned, 10 years in the cuck, perfect for a musical instrument. He carved the top, thin, light, with the right curve for resonance. The body was made of 3 pieces glued together with fish glue, acoustically calibrated. Dan wasn't a luthier, but he was a materials engineer who understood how wood vibrates, how the thickness of the walls affects the timbre, how the shape of the soundbox changes the overtones. Bone pegs, lightweight, precise. He asked Irene to get the strings from the gunsmith. Steel wire, thin, even. Dan strung it, tuned it, plucked it with his finger. The sound was clear, deep, alive. He handed the lute to Lily. She took it, played the first chord, and stopped. Sat there with her mouth open. Played the second, the third. A melody, the same one she'd played before, but the sound was different, just as she heard it inside, just as it sounded in her head when she closed her eyes and imagined the music. For the first time, the instrument sounded exactly as she felt it. Lily played for half an hour, without stopping. Then she placed the lute on her lap. Her cheeks were wet. She said she had never heard her music for real. Dan nodded. He knew that feeling. When the instrument stops getting in the way and starts helping, when the instrument becomes an extension of your hand. Dan stood in the hall of the Vesper palace and looked at the king, an old man with heavy eyelids and a gold chain around his neck. Solveig sat nearby, upright, composed. Her eyes followed her father's every movement. Dan had been introduced to the court as the head of the Guild of New Masters. He spoke for 20 minutes, without fanfare, no promises. He spoke in numbers. The artisans' quarter. A year ago, 7 closed workshops, now 5 are operational. Glassmaking, pottery, soap-making, blacksmithing. A dye house that Rita had started after learning to make not only soap, but also dyes from the same vegetable fats and pigments. Employment, 23 people. A year ago, 0. The quarter's income, 600 gold pieces a year. Not a single coin from guild subsidies. Water filters, installed in 12 taverns and 4 shelters in the lower city. Cases of intestinal diseases in these places have dropped by 2/3. Dan recited the figures. The king listened. His eyelids didn't flicker, but Dan could see that he was listening. When Dan finished, the king asked a single question. He asked if the guild could operate in other cities. Dan said it could, that the technology was teachable, that he needed apprentices and facilities. The king was silent. Then he nodded to Solveig. She stood up. She read the second decree. The Guild of New Masters is permitted to open branches in any city of Velmar. The royal treasury is allocating 100 gold pieces for the first 3 schools. A month later, Ella left for Redmark to open the first school, her hometown. The Vanderlyn estate was no longer mortgaged. Ella had bought it back with money earned by the guild. Her 3 sisters were at home. Her mother was recovering. Ella returned there not as an impoverished baroness, but as the head of the fastest-growing organization in the kingdom. Dan saw her off at the gates of Vespera. Ella stood by a cart loaded with boxes of equipment and scrolls of documents. In her hand she held an abacus, that very one. A wooden frame, wire, beads, a year's worth of use, polished smooth by her fingers. Dan told her to take care of herself. Ella smiled. She said she wasn't the kind of person you needed to tell to be careful. Then she fell silent. She looked at him. She said she was grateful, not for the money, not for the job, for the abacus, for the fact that he saw her mind and not her surname. Dan nodded. Ella got into the cart. Then she turned around. She said she would be back. Dan said he knew. The caravan empire was on the move. Solveig's spies reported that the emperor had learned of the guild. of the master from the mud, of things without gold. The golden tide was crushing the border principalities. 3 of them had already lost their lands. People were fleeing to Velmar. Among the refugees were craftsmen. Dan took them in. He taught them. Every new apprentice meant a new pair of hands, a new workshop, a new city that could stand on its own without gold veins. Kervin sent an ultimatum. Hand over the master known as Dan of Vesper, or War. Solveig showed the ultimatum to Dan. His face turned pale. He said he couldn't be the cause of war, that he would leave. Solveig looked at him coldly. She said there would be war with or without him, that Kervin didn't want him, but what he had created, the system, the knowledge. If they handed Dan over, the knowledge would remain, the students would remain, the workshop would remain, and Kervin would come anyway. Dan sat down. He rubbed his face. Solveig is right. She's always been right. She said there's another way. Not a war of force, a war of supply. Velmar won't win head-on. The army is smaller. The magic is weaker. There's less gold. But if Velmar's army is better supplied, better equipped, healthier, more mobile, then they could hold their ground. Dan asked what she needed. Solveig gave him a list. Light armor, not made of steel, made of something that could be produced quickly and in large quantities. Water flasks with filters for every soldier, bandages with antiseptic, signal devices for communication between units, waterproof cloaks, portable stoves for warmth on the march. Dan listened. The list was enormous, but every item was doable. Every item was a thing, and he knew how to make things. 2 months. Dan worked harder than he ever had in his life. The whole workshop was working. Hannah was making ceramic flasks with built-in filters, hundreds of them. Greg was forging lightweight breastplates from hardened steel, not full-plate armor, leather-backed plates, quick to produce, lightweight, sufficient to stop an arrow and a glancing blow. Rita was making antiseptic soap, large bars for the army's needs. Maya was putting together medical kits, herbs, ointments, bandages soaked in antiseptic. Lily helped with packing and inventory. Her lute player's precise fingers proved ideal for detailed work. Irene advised on equipment. She knew what a soldier needed on the march, what got in the way, what chafed, what got wet. Ella from Redmark sent wagons with raw materials. Dan slept 4 hours at a time. He ate on the gram. He was losing weight. Hannah brought him tea and food and set it next to his desk, silently, every time. He didn't always notice, but she always brought it. The war lasted 3 months. Velmar won, not by force, logistics. The caravan army marched through the mountain passes, heavy, in golden armor, with golden artifacts, powerful, invincible in open combat. But the passes were narrow and long and cold. The Velmar units did not engage in battle. They held the passes. They drank clean water from flasks with filters while the Kervenians fell ill from mountain streams. They warmed themselves by portable stoves while the Kervenians froze in wet cloaks. They bandaged their wounds with clean bandages while the Kervenians rotted from infection. They exchanged signals while the Kervenians lost contact between units in the mountain fog. 3 months later, Kerven retreated, not defeated, exhausted. For the first time in 100 years, the Empire failed to take what it wanted. Not because of magic, not because of gold, because of canteens, because of soap, because of bandages, because of things made by hand. 2 years. Master Voen stood in front of Dan's workshop door. He didn't go in. He just stood there. Dan saw him from the window. He went out. They stood facing each other on the empty morning street. Voen had aged. His wrinkles were deeper. His shoulders slumped. The guild's silver chain was still around his neck, but now it looked heavier than before. Voen said the guild had been disbanded, yesterday, by royal decree, not banned, dissolved, because 3/4 of its masters had left on their own, joined the guild or opened their own shops, because the gold veins are dry and there's nothing to pay the guild dues with, because customers go to the masters who make things better and cheaper. Dan listened. He nodded. He wasn't happy. He didn't see an enemy before him. He saw an old man who had spent his whole life building a wall and was now watching it crumble. Voen fell silent. Then he said something Dan hadn't expected. He said that 700 years ago, the old masters had been destroyed by the first guild, by his ancestors, but not because they were feared, because they saw where a world without limits would lead. The old masters knew too much. They created things that changed reality, not with magic, with their hands. And when one of them created something that could feed 1,000 people from a handful of soil, and another created something that could destroy a city wall with sound, and a third created something that could change the weather in the valley, then a war began between the masters, not for gold, for knowledge, for the right to decide what could be created and what could not. The war destroyed 4 cities, thousands died. The first guild won and sealed away the knowledge, under the gold standard, under dogma, under religion. Gold became not the foundation of value, but a cage, a limiter, so that no one could ever again create something that would destroy the world. Voen looked at Dan. He said that Dan had found the old master's workshop beneath Vesper. Dan nodded. He had found it 2 months ago, an underground chamber, stone walls, workbenches made of an unknown metal, tools he couldn't identify, and a door, sealed, in the far wall. No lock, no handle. A smooth stone slab with a single indentation in the center, in the shape of a palm. Voen said that behind this door lay the answer, the knowledge of the old masters, everything they knew, everything they created, and everything they destroyed. He said that 3 before Dan had found this door, 3 just like him, who had come from another world, with hands that knew more than this world could contain. All 3 refused to open it, because they knew how it might end. Voen asked what Dan would do. Dan stood there. He looked at Voen. Then he said he wanted to see the door. Together. Voen blinked. He hadn't expected that. Dan said he wouldn't go alone, that he'd take his people. All of them. And Voen too. Because if behind the door lay knowledge capable of both creating and destroying, then deciding what to do with it shouldn't be left to just one person. Voen was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. They went down into the dungeon that evening. Dan, Hannah, Ella, who had arrived from Redmark that morning, Maya, Irene, with a sword at her belt, Lily, Greg, Rita, Orvin. The old man was breathing steadily. The inhalation bowl had been doing its job month after month. He hadn't fully recovered, but he was walking, on his own 2 feet, and Voen, bringing up the rear. The old master's workshop lay beneath the foundation of an ancient temple, 3 flights of stairs down, a stone hall as wide as a square, workbenches, shelves, tools, and a door. Dan approached. He ran his finger along the palm-shaped indentation. The stone was warm, alive. He knew the door responded to hands that knew, that had created, that in their final act in a past life had made something for a specific person, out of love, not duty. A teapot for a client's grandmother, unfinished, finished in his mind a second before death. Dan placed his palm in the indentation. The stone hummed, low, deep, like a cello. The door didn't open, it dissolved, like fog. Behind it was light, not golden, not magical, white, pure, like the morning sun through clear glass. Dan stood in the doorway. Beyond the door was a hall, huge, bright. Walls of white stone, and on every wall, shelves, and on the shelves, things, hundreds of things, thousands, tools, bowls, lenses, devices, mechanisms, things he couldn't understand at first glance, things he understood immediately. A foot-powered potter's wheel, a lens the size of a head, a loom he had never seen before, but whose principle he could guess, and in the center of the room, a table, and on the table, a scroll. Dan walked over, unrolled it. The text was in a language he didn't know, but beneath the text was a drawing, simple, clear. 2 hands, one holding a hammer, the other holds a flower, and an inscription that he somehow managed to read. Create for the one who is near. Not for everyone, for one. And then what is created will not destroy the world, but build it. Dan stood and looked at the drawing. Two before him had turned away from the door, because they were afraid, not of knowledge, of themselves, afraid they wouldn't be able to handle it, that knowledge would prove stronger, that they would create something that would destroy. Dan understood them, but he knew something they didn't. He knew that the value of a thing isn't in what it's made of, not in the knowledge put into it, but in who it's made for. A teapot for a grandmother with arthritis, a knife for a girl who's afraid of blood, a jug for an innkeeper, a belt for a herbalist to a knife, a comb for a woman valued only for her surname, a lute for a girl who has never heard her own music, a sword for a warrior who does not want to kill, a ring for an old man who has loved for 40 years and beyond death, a bowl for an old glassblower who is suffocating. Each item for one person. In this lies the limitation, and in this lies the strength. To create for the one who is near, not for everyone. Then it is safe. Then knowledge serves rather than enslaves. Dan turned to his people. They stood behind him. 10 people. His guild, his home. He looked at each one. Khan, 18 years old, master potter, with a straight back and hands that make cups more beautiful than his own. Ella, with an abacus in her hand, always with an abacus, manager of 3 schools, sharp, precise, indispensable. Maya, barefoot, with a belt full of vials, smelling of herbs in the forest, the best gold-free alchemist in all of Aurelian. Irene, with a sword that protects rather than kills, standing tall, like a wall between Dan and everything that could harm him. Lily, with a lute on her back, quiet, strong, having chosen her path. Greg, with one hand and a clamp on the anvil, the best blacksmith in the neighborhood. Rita, with hands red from lye, smelling of lavender. Orvin, old, sick, alive, breathing, his father in this world. And Voen, standing apart, with a heavy chain around his neck and tired eyes, a man who was afraid and came anyway. Dan looked at them, then he looked at the hall beyond the door. At thousands of things, at thousands of insights, at thousands of possibilities. He said this legacy did not belong to him. It belonged to everyone willing to learn, to everyone willing to create, to those nearby. Hannah stepped forward first. Maya followed her. The rest followed. They entered the hall. The light was warm and even, like in a workshop early in the morning, when the kiln is already heated and the clay is waiting on the table. 3 years. Dan stood on the hill behind Vesper. The city lay below. The gilded domes still glistened, but next to them, new roofs were rising. Workshops, schools, factories. Not golden, clay, wooden, brick. Alive. Smoke rose from 20 chimneys in the artisans' quarter. Behind Dan stood a house. Large, new. He had built it himself, with the help of Greg and the carpenters from the workshop. A stone first floor, a wooden second, a pottery studio in the left wing, a smithy in the courtyard, a glass furnace in the right wing, a garden behind the house, full of herbs, lush, with sage and lemon balm and lavender and 100 other plants whose names Dan never learned. Inside the house were 12 rooms, and not a single locked door. Hannah's room with shelves holding her cups, each with a small flower on the bottom. Ella's room with an abacus on the table and stacks of papers reaching the ceiling. Maya's room smelling of the forest. Irene's room with a sword on the wall and a soft armchair by the window. Lily's room, from which music drifted in the evenings. Orvin's room was the warmest, by the stove wall. Greg's room with a workbench instead of a table. Rita's room with dried lavender flowers above the bed. And his room, small, with a window facing east, with a potter's wheel in the corner, with a lump of clay on the table. Always, just in case. Morning. Dan went down to the kitchen. Hannah had already put the kettle on. She was always the first to get up. Ella was sitting at the table, counting. She was always counting. Maya came in from the street with a bunch of mint in her hand. Irene was sharpening a knife in the kitchen. Not a sword, a knife, for bread. Lily was playing something quietly in the next room. Orvin was coming down the stairs, slowly, but on his own. Greg was hammering in the yard, the morning rhythm of a hammer on an anvil. Dan sat down at the table. Hannah placed a cup of tea in front of him. Without a word, right on cue, Dan took the cup, simple, white, with a small flower on the bottom. Hannah made it, for him. He drank his tea and looked at his people, at his home, at the morning light streaming through the window and settling on the table as a warm patch. Like the light in the old master's gallery, warm, even. Like in the workshop, when the kiln is heated and the clay is waiting on the table. Dan set down the cup. He looked at his hands, the same hands, from Portland, from wet clay, from 3 in the morning, with calluses from 12 years of work. Hands that make things, not just things, things for those close to him. He stood up, went to the studio. A lump of clay lay on the table. He picked it up, kneaded it, sat down at the wheel, kicked the pedal with his foot. The wheel spun. The clay rose between his fingers. The walls were thin. The rim was smooth. A cup. For whom? He didn't know yet. But someone would come. Someone always comes. With a ring, with a sword, with an illness, with pain, with a broken thing that is more precious than all the golden cups in the world. And he will make it, with his hands, for that person, just as he used to. Dan smiled. The wheel spun. The clay rose. The morning sun flooded the workshop. Let's move on.